Chama. Sawadee Cup and welcome to another episode here for the Fight Principles podcast, where we look into martial arts, martial artists, and see what we can take from those martial artists and apply to our actual real life. And today we're looking into one of the GOATs. For many it's the GOAT, for some it's like one of the GOATs, but definitely one of the greatest mixed martial arts MMA fighters to ever have laced up the gloves in the UFC octagon. We're talking about George Rush St-Pierre and the science of fighting and his never-ending pursuit of perfection. So the initial questions we can ask ourselves when we're looking at GSP is, what does it take to become the most complete fighter in the world? Because that's a moniker that many would agree GSP, George St-Pierre, fits very well. And the interesting thing is, when you look at GSP, that he wasn't the strongest, he wasn't the fastest, or definitely not the most aggressive, but he was almost always the smartest fighter to ever step inside the octagon. His approach to strategy, discipline, adaptability, all that made him one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time. So it's just fitting that we're looking into him and looking into what can we learn from the mindset of the great George St-Pierre. And so let's dive into that, the making of the champion, the making of GSP as we know him. And when we look at his early life in the beginning, I mean, we all know that he's from Canada. He talked openly about being bullied as a kid, and that this then led to him training in Kyokushin karate. And he also mentioned that he was inspired by Jean-Claude Van Damme, as so many people in his age range, and I count myself as one of those. So of course, being inspired by Jean-Claude Van Damme. And interesting, what I found out while doing research on GSP was that he also actually had jobs as garbage collector or even as a nightclub bouncer just to afford training. Just imagine GSP as a bouncer, and probably the most polite bouncer ever. Eventually he transitioned into kickboxing and then BJJ, and so he slowly built out his well-rounded skill set. He earned his black belt in BJJ under Renzo Gracie, very famous of course, and then later on in his career became a very wrestling heavy fighter, despite, and that's very interesting, not having a collegiate wrestling background. Usually wrestling heavy fighters, they come from a wrestling heavy college background. GSP did not. GSP actually learned how to wrestle for MMA. So yeah, unlike most fighters, GSP kind of like sought out expert coaches for every single discipline. So he went to train with Freddie Roach for boxing. He went to Firas Zahabi for BJJ and like overall MMA strategy, the very famous coach out of Canada, right? He went to Greg Jackson for like game planning, fight IQ, and so on. He trained with Olympic wrestlers to improve his takedown ability. So he purposefully looked to like the best of the best of the best to then actually learn from those people. I mean, it's famous, and you might have seen that if you're into martial arts. He actually asked Joe Rogan, the podcaster, former Taekwondo fighter, he asked Joe Rogan to show him this back kick, right? His spinning back kick, and then practice it. So he always learns. So he had this very scientific approach to training and recovery, and yet this scientific approach to learning from everybody helped him to stay at top of the game longer than most of the other champions, especially in his era. So my first key takeaway from that is that mastery of any topic comes from a student mindset. You're always learning. You never assume you know everything, because there's always more to it. And GSP is the perfect example of always wanting to get better. Even now, after retirement, he's still training. He still wants to get better. And that's something that the greats have in common. We talked about this with Mighty Mouse, Demetrius Johnson, the last episode. And we're also seeing this here with GSP again. Then one of the things that stood out the most, as I mentioned already, was of course his strategic mindset. Right? He approached fights like a chess match. And he studied opponents, he looked at the weaknesses. So he didn't only rely on his own strengths, like I'm amazing. He's like, okay, I'm great, I know I'm good, but how can I exploit their weaknesses? And then he tried to blend different things together, like karate footwork, boxing jabs, the Olympic style wrestling, BJJ, and try to create this MMA system, like not just relying on one discipline as so many experts in one area, but he tried to blend it all seamlessly together, which was, at his time, something pretty impressive. The most shocking loss of his career was the one to Matt Serra. And it was a very shocking TKO defeat. And so he had to rethink his approach, but not only his training, but also his mental approach. And when he came back way stronger, way more successful. Yeah, he had a more risk-averse approach to fighting, more of like a control-based fighting style that led to like what is still an unprecedented championship reign. And so the takeaway that we can have here is that success isn't only about being the best at one thing, it's about adapting to every single situation. Yeah. So yeah, before he was like really good at several things, he lost and he said, okay, I have to come back with an even better system. I blend everything better together. I create a more risk-averse fighting style. I'm just increasing control and make sure that I'm always out of harm's way, which is just a smart approach. So adapting to all those situations made him who he then eventually became and who we know, right? The champion that ruled for so long. So I think that's a takeaway we can also apply to life. Don't be the best at one thing. Yeah, you have to be able to adapt to different situations. And speaking of that, right? So when we look at GSP's mental discipline and like fear management, I think he's probably one of the first fighters to openly discuss how he worked with sports psychologists together. And he actually admitted that he was afraid before fights. He said he was scared. He didn't like fighting. He loved training. He loved the process. He did not like fighting. But instead of suppressing it, he channeled that fear into like focus. Like, okay, I'm scared, but I'm not running away. I will focus on the task at hand and I will overcome it. Yeah, and so he famously also explained how he used visualization techniques, rehearsing every single move, every round, every outcome, so that he was always prepared for everything that could happen. You might say that he implemented over preparation, but this over preparation helped him to eliminate self-doubt. And so by the time like fight night arrived, he had already won the battle in his head, because that battle in his head was way worse than whatever would have awaited him in the octagon. So this over preparation helped him to eliminate self-doubt. So I'm not saying we all have to over prepare all the time, because that's of course super exhausting, but I do think that we can learn from his approach to fear, because fear isn't weakness. And fear can be used as a tool when we control it. And GSP controlled it in a way that he realized, okay, I'm scared, I'm afraid, but I'm not running away from it. I channel it and I focus on the task at hand, and I will overcome the task at hand. So I think that's a very powerful lesson that we can learn here from GSP. And when we look at him and his legacy, I think first we have to be impressed by for how long he held the welterweight title, for 2,064 days, the longest reign in the division's history. Then, I mean, GSP became kind of like the blueprint for modern fighters. Technical, strategic, mentally unbreakable. Just something that, I mean, to this day, you ask like, who's your favorite fighter, or who do you try to model your career after? GSP will be one of the answers that most fighters will give, especially the smart ones who don't want to do too much damage. And he retired as a champion, which doesn't happen often. And then he returned years later to win the middleweight championship in the UFC, like the weight class above, the class he fought before against Michael Bisping, which then again proved that he's very adaptable and also made a point of his longevity. And one of the things he still does to this day is advocating for A, athlete health, and B, fighter pay. So he still shows lots of leadership beyond the cage, which not many fighters do actually. And I think the takeaway here is simply that the greatest martial artists, they aren't just fighters. That they don't just go like, oh, fight, 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 fight. They're thinkers. They're innovators. They're lifelong learners. They never stop progressing in whatever area it might be, physically, mentally, anything. Famously, George St-Pierre talked about like how he believed in aliens and that he thought he was abducted, and and then he actually kind of like reversed his stance a little. He still thinks or believes in supernatural stuff. He says, oh, maybe I thought about this wrong, which also shows growth. Like he does more research, he learns more about things, and then he he reconsiders his stance, which again, not many people do. That shows growth, mental growth. So there are so many things to learn from George St-Pierre, I believe. And seeing how a champion who could easily say, I'm the greatest of all time, doesn't sit back and chills and just like wants people to tell him how awesome he is very, very impressive and something we can learn a lot from. And so to sum up what I think we can take away from looking into GSP's career and approach to the game is always train like a student. And no matter how skilled you become, how awesome your spinning roundhouse kick is, how great your takedown defense is, how awesome you hit the anaconda choke, always train like a student. That also applies for life, not just for martial arts. Yeah, approach everything you do in life like a situation in which you can still be better. You're great at your job, yeah, you can still be better. You're great with your friends, sure, but you can still be more helpful, right? So why not try to be better? Secondly, he taught us that we can use strategy over emotion. Yeah, he controlled the fight, he didn't just react to it. Amazing takeaway for life. Control what is controllable and don't just react to it. And lastly, he taught us that fear and doubt are normal. One of the greatest champions to ever fight in the UFC was scared of the fights, afraid of stepping into the octagon. So fear and doubt are normal. It matters how you prepare for it. Don't let fear and doubt lame you, freeze you. Use it to focus, to be better, and to give it your all to overcome that fear. And I think that's a very powerful takeaway from GSP's career. So George St-Pierre showed us that fighting, it's not just about power, it's about intelligence, discipline, adaptability. So all the lessons we just discussed in the last almost 15 minutes are lessons we can learn and that we can take away and apply to our own lives. Now I'm of course curious to see or to hear, what do you take away from GSP? Did GSP inspire you for your martial arts training in life? Shout out, let me know. Ideally either comments on social media at Fight Principles or on Spotify directly in the comments. Looking forward to what you have to say. Until then, I hope you're inspired by GSP. We're coming back with another episode next week. I hope you do stay safe, take care, always keep your guard up. Until then, Chama, Sawadee Cup.